All right, welcome to April 8th. This is Lecture 3, and I want to continue on discussing about how we can understand the liturgical movement of Holy Week as a transformative opportunity for congregational life to begin to think through how it understands its place in the kingdom and the call to live out this gospel of reconciliation. So we talked about the Final Supper as a place of shared space, of proximity, of maybe breaking down some of the barriers that exist between us and them, not simply in theory or in speech, but in actual practice of sharing a meal with one another. But then I want to talk about for a moment here is that at this Last Supper, especially as it's found in Luke and other Gospels, is the sharing of what we're going to eventually end up calling the Eucharist, the sharing of the bread and the cup. And what I want to say, without getting into a full expression of what the Eucharist means and all of that, again, for brevity's sake, I want to suggest to us that what this might teach us, in fact, is that this meal shared by Jesus is actually taken up into the very life of the church, and that we are called to live Eucharistically. So with the cup, or with the bread, Jesus, it says he takes it, right? He lifts it up, he gives thanks, he blesses it, he breaks it, and then he shares it. And I kind of believe that the Eucharistic life for the church is one in which we allow ourselves to be taken into the hands of Jesus, blessed for the sake not simply of ourselves but others, broken, right? And I believe that reconciliation emerges from a life that understands both fragility and vulnerability and is willing to be broken so that it can be shared with others. And so even the idea of sharing in the Eucharist during Holy Week speaks to the possibilities of understanding the church's life as a reconciling endeavor within the life of the world in which we live. But then it's fascinating because if you follow in Luke's gospel, just after Jesus blesses and breaks and it says, "This is my blood emptied out for you, this is my body broken for you," immediately, even at that dinner, there is a debate that is waged between who is the greatest at that table. And I think what this points to is the perpetual desire for supremacy that must always be called into question. And this is what Jesus drills down at in the midst of his conversation with his disciples. And he begins to say, my kingdom doesn't look like the world's kingdoms, and my leadership doesn't look like the world's leadership, where in Gentiles they lord it over you. That's not how we operate here. But there is this presumptuousness about supremacy, about greatness, about people being able to point to us. And I've seen this even happen in the work of reconciliation. People get impassioned by a call to justice, and they want people to applaud them and point at how great they are for their concern for injustice. And I think that the Eucharistic life wants to point to something contrary to that. And I think what Jesus wants to point humanity to is to the inherent fragility of human character and the fickleness of the human heart, to stay steadfast in the recognition that in order for us to be concerned about the oppressed, we have to consistently abandon our tenacious desire to be considered something meaningful. The next event that I want to talk about, which is found in John 13, is the foot washing, which I think is, again, it's interesting. It says that having loved those that God gave him, he now displays his full love by washing the feet of his disciples. This idea of the word we use in Greek is this idea of kenosis, this emptying out, this posture of pouring ourselves out, of taking the very role of a servant. If you think about the Philippians 2 passage, I think that is key in this. And what would it look like, even within the liturgical movement of the Holy Week, to even participate in a foot washing that, again, brings us off our high horse, reminds us of the humility requisite of the follower of Jesus, again, draws us into the heart of servanthood, empties out our postures of power and privilege, and invites us again to take up the role of servant. So I think, again, even liturgically, the foot washing can matter in terms of the call to reconciliation, because I can't be reconciled to those whom I believe I stand over and feel like I have privileges over and against that person. I must lower myself and come and meet that person right where they are. And then there's this idea of the prayer in the garden, right? And the prayer in the garden, I think, is important for us in terms of reconciliation, because without understanding the wellspring, where it comes from, where the sustaining grace and the call of God comes from, we will get so out there being active about this faith that we will lose the sense of what can sustain us and keep us when things get difficult. I believe that there is a spirituality of activism. In fact, one of the things that I hope to write during this summer is called a spirituality for activism, because I see so many activists out there that are fighting for justice, but they don't understand the spirituality that needs to be rooted in that call to justice. And I think what the prayer of the garden recognizes is that Jesus can't go to the cross until he's first come to the Father, until he's recognizing the origin of the sustaining grace, until he's reckoned with his internal resistance. There's going to be moments where we call into question whether or not our participation in racial reconciliation is even worth our time. Or we're going to say, God, maybe someone else can do this. Maybe I don't have to do this. Maybe someone else can take this up as their call. And I think that's one of the challenges that folks face. We've got to reckon. Remember when Jesus says, is there any other way that this can happen? Let this cup pass before me. That prayer causes us or forces us to reckon with our internal resistances to our participation and contribution in the work of racial reconciliation. And then there's this idea that I think prayer realigns the desires of our hearts. And I think you see this evidenced in John chapter 17, in which Jesus is realigning the priorities of the kingdom based upon the Father's will and desires. And I think, again, one of the things that does is that sustains the kind of resistance that is necessary to seek racial reconciliation, but to not use the weapons of warfare that the world would use, or the kinds of methodologies that the world would use. And so I think prayer is consistently important in this. The next one I'm going to talk to you about, I think, is evidence through a series of events that is going to be key for us in terms of our conversations about racial reconciliation, especially in light of what some of you had already experienced on campus even before we left throughout this pandemic crisis. And that is the realism that comes with racial reconciliation. And the language that is often used in today's world is that the work of justice is not sexy. And I think oftentimes that's the way people think of it, is it's going to be cool, it's going to be hip, it's going to be something that people are going to envy us for. And that's just not the case, because people who are concerned about justice have a way of upending apple carts and calling into question the status quo that makes people uncomfortable. And so we should expect, with a certain degree of realism, the nature of how this is going to impact and affect our relationships. If you think about Jesus, the closer he gets to the cross, the ways in which he experiences both betrayal and abandonment. And this realism, I think, forces us come to face with the realities that some will dispute you. Some will wonder if this is even necessary. Some will call you into account for what you are suggesting. Some will try to spin what you're saying. Some will locate you outside of orthodoxy because they'll want to assume that you have been taken captive by social justice, which is no longer evangelical, and yada, yada, yada. Some will dispute you. Some will misunderstand you. As you talk about racial reconciliation, they're going to suggest that somehow you're trying to beat them down, or you're trying to throw stones at them, or you're trying to distance yourself from them because you somehow think you're better than they are. Some will misunderstand you. Some will roll with you early only to betray you later. And so some will think, well, it's good when it doesn't cost much, but then if something big happens around you and something's called in question, they may actually betray you to others, right? They may betray your trust. You may have said something in private to them. I've watched this happen in churches as pastors have become impassioned about the call to justice, the call to racial reconciliation. They will speak in confidence, perhaps even to a staff member, who then the staff member takes it to a board member, and then the board member starts challenging the pastor on things that were spoken behind closed doors. People will betray you. Some will back out when you need them most. There's going to be moments when you're trotting ahead in this call to justice, and all of a sudden, as you get close to it, some will, who you thought were with you all the way till the end, will all of a sudden back out when you need them the most. I experienced this. My friends and I experienced this in one of our first ministries in Clarksville First Church of the Nazarene. It was great church, but as we began to explore some of the different systemic brokennesses throughout Clarksville, there was a group of people who we loved and loved dearly, but they just couldn't roll with us. There was a disconnect theologically between what we were doing and what they were wanting, and we thought we were on the same page. We were all close. We were friends, and yet at some level they didn't want to participate in the work that we believed that the kingdom of God was calling us to. And so there needs to be a sense of realism that if you're going to do this work, it's probably going to be costly in terms of the relationships that you're involved in. I'm going to pick up the rest of Holy Week in this next lecture and then just give you some final thoughts.